The inspiration for today's lesson was taken from the article that appears beneath the fold in your bulletin. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. He's a Canadian, and he does a lot of good stuff online that relates to church growth. And this is only a part of a longer article that he wrote. And this one is entitled, Why Christians Should Stop Saying Prayer Works. You think, well, what's wrong with saying something like that? But he wants us to think about what we're saying when we use that particular phrase. Now, in the next couple of weeks, and we'll probably take a break for Mother's Day in 2 weeks, but we want to get around to the rest of this article that he wrote, because he mentions two other things that he thinks that we say as Christians that maybe we ought to reconsider what we're actually saying when we say that. But look at the article with me. One reason people stay away from Christianity is not because they don't know any Christians. It's often because they do. All right, got your attention? Our actions and our words as followers of Jesus have the power to attract or repel people from Christianity. The number of people who never go to church or follow Jesus keeps growing. And you've probably heard that now on some of those lists where they ask for your church affiliation, some have started putting nuns, N-O-N-E-S. And their thinking keeps changing. So what can we do about it? Well, in addition to modeling humility, grace, truth, love, and so many other things that describe the earliest Christ followers, we Christians can watch our words. And so that's the title of our lesson this morning, Words. And how can we use words wisely? In that vein, here is something Christians should really stop saying. Prayer works. Should we really stop saying that prayer works? Well, yes and no. Most people who say prayer works these days really mean God did what I wanted him to do. And that's what sometimes the outsider's hearing. Prayer works. God did what I wanted him to do, when I wanted him to do it. As if prayer was a button to be pushed to release exactly what they wanted from the vending machine. Prayer is not a button to be pushed, it's a relationship to be pursued. Prayer does work, but it works very differently than we'd like. It still works when we can't trace out any direct result from our prayer. Did your prayer work if you can't trace it out? When the opposite of what we prayed for happens, as Paul said, Lord, would you take this thorn from my flesh? And 3 times God says, no, I'm going to hear your prayer and work by keeping the thorn there, because my strength will be better shown in your weakness. Well, in those moments when we feel very distant from God, is prayer working? My God, why have you forsaken me? Seems like somebody said that from the cross. When we bang down the door of heaven for years and are not sure anything is going on up there at all. There are scores of people inside and outside the church whose spirits are crushed because they prayed fervently and they didn't get the job. Their mom died of cancer. Their child was born without a heartbeat. They ended up in a car crash that left them permanently disabled. Prayer doesn't work because I got what I wanted and they didn't. See, what he's saying here is when we say something like that and someone else over here, perhaps an outsider who just started praying, prayed for his mother to be cured of cancer and it didn't happen, how does he feel when we say something like that? Does it draw him closer to the Lord, or does it push him farther away? Well, it doesn't work for me. I'm out of here. We can have a negative effect by maybe even stating something that is true. It's just that we don't know how prayer works. The parade of saints across the centuries would have been shocked to see prayer reduced to God doing what I ask him to do when I ask him to do it. God is not a puppy to be trained or a chef in the kitchen who prepares food to suit our every whim. He is sovereign. And so we pray, and we sometimes say, I'm suspicious that God has answered this prayer in a way that I desired him to answer it, but sometimes you're never sure what God is up to. And that's where faith or trust kicks in. And I think God is more interested in our trusting him, even when things don't look like we'd like them to look. They're not turning out the way we'd like them to turn out. But God may have something better in mind than to say yes to whatever it is that we're asking. So let's look at our outline here, words. And we as Christ followers need to give careful thought to our words if we want to speak wisely, okay? So in order to speak wisely, we must recognize and be aware that words are powerful. We may throw them out casually, but the words that we speak have power. The wise man in Proverbs said it this way: the tongue can bring death or life. Those who love to talk will reap the consequences. Have you ever reaped consequences that you wished weren't tacked on to what you had just said? You would take back maybe what you said if you could eliminate the consequences here. Generally, most everything we say has some sort of positive or negative consequence attached to it. Life or death, the wise man said. Then you go on to chapter 10 of Proverbs. Too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and keep your mouth shut. Is that plain enough? Too much talk leads to sin. Be sensible and close it. The more we talk, have you ever thought of that in this way? The more we talk, the more likely we are to sin. If you read the book of James, he says, if you can control your tongue, you're a perfect person, able to control whatever. When we talk about self-control, we think of a lot of things that need to be brought under control. But I think in James's book, the thing that he thinks that is most out of control, most in need of control, and shows that we can control other things is our speech. Because there's so many ways we can be out of control with our speech. We can be cussing, we can be gossiping, we can be boasting, which he mentions. We can be putting others down and have judgmental speech. Such a variety of ways that our speech can be out of control. So he says the more you talk, the more likely you are to sin. So it pays us to recognize the power of our words and how they can lead us into sin or into bad situations, and to refrain from so much talk. We can boast, he says, we can bless somebody with the same mouth. We can bless the Father and curse our neighbor. He says, does that make sense, that bitter and sweet water comes from the same source? Oh, praise the Lord and curse him. No, we're out of control. He says, if you can't control your tongue, you don't have a bridle on your tongue, your religion is worthless. Chapter 1 and verse 27. Before we get to number 2, read on your outline there at the bottom of the page, Proverbs 15, verse 4, gentle words are a tree of life. A deceitful tongue crushes the spirit. There's power there. And then Proverbs 17:27, a truly wise person uses few words. A person with understanding is even-tempered. As James put it in James chapter 1, be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger, because quite often anger goes with our speaking. Number 2, in order to speak wisely, we need to be aware that words are flexible. How about that? Words are flexible. For example, when I say blue, what do you think of? You say, well, you're wearing, and I hope I'm right on this, blue. I got caught on that a while back referring to a green coat that I had, and my wife said, that's not green. Okay, we differ on the color here. But it was kind of a greenish, brownish, and the brown won out. When I say blue, it can have a variety of meanings. If I were to say to Brother Doyle back here, for example, you're looking blue, he might respond by saying, how about them Cowboys? Did you know how well they did in the NFL draft? Okay. But I could say to someone else the same thing, you're looking blue. They said, no, I'm not depressed. Or, yeah, you got it right, I am feeling blue. Someone says, well, I say to them, you're looking blue. And they say, no, 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 no. I'm a Republican. I live in a blue state, but I'm a Republican. Okay? That word blue has a lot of flexibility, and you can probably add to some of that. I remember several years ago, there was a senior saint that I was talking to out before church began on the sidewalk out there. And I thought she had dressed well, and I said, you're looking spiffy today. And I didn't notice a reaction at the time, but later I found out she didn't like what I said. So I went to her and I said, what was it that I said that was a problem? And she fessed up and she said, you said I look sniffy. Well, you know, sniffy can mean a lot of things. It's pretty flexible. It can mean you don't pass the sniff test. It can mean you've got a problem like I do with sniffing and allergies during this time of the year. And I tried to convince her that, no, I didn't say sniffy. I said spiffy. That was intended as a compliment. Words really get flexible when you think someone heard what you meant. They heard it maybe correctly, but they took it in a different sense because words are flexible. Now, she heard a different word, but sometimes they can hear the word accurately, and then they attach a different meaning to it than what I attached to that, okay? So we need to be careful with our words and slow to speak them sometimes because words can have that kind of flexibility. And sometimes it's the tone. I may say something perfectly correct, perfectly innocent, perfectly complimentary, or whatever, and it always slays me when someone says, well, the tone you used when you said, well, I did not mean it that way. I'm sorry if my tone led you in the wrong direction, okay? Speech is powerful, and the words that we use sometimes can be taken in different ways. Don't assume because you meant something, that's what someone heard. And sometimes we have to check if we want to be wise. Number 3, we need to be aware that wise speaking begins with careful listening. Now, this is a tough one here. Be quick to listen, James said, slow to speak. Quick to listen. I'll admit, I'm not the best listener. I'm trying to become a better listener, not only to your conversation, but to the conversation I carry on with God in prayer. I hadn't really plugged into that prayer is listening as well as talking. Whenever you read the Word and you ask God to speak to you through His Word and to understand His Word, and then you begin your prayer, if you're quiet and if you're listening, it's amazing what sometimes might happen as you hear God saying something to you. we'll say more about that at another time. But listening is a part of being wise in responding when we speak to someone. The wise man in Proverbs said, to answer before listening, that is folly and shame. But how often do we do it? How often do we not get all the information, all of the facts before we respond to it? I remember one time the commentator George Will was saying something and someone interrupted him before he finished. And he corrected the individual and he said, would you let me finish my sentence? I know where it's going and you don't. Okay? Now, how many times have you interrupted someone in mid-sentence and you didn't let them fully flesh out what they were going to say, and that's not where they were going at all? So we have to begin by listening and make sure we listen well here if we're going to respond in a good way. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul said to the church there, do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up, according to their needs, that it may benefit those who listen. Now, how are you going to say something that is wholesome, that is beneficial, that is helpful to someone else according to their needs until you have listened carefully to what those needs are? Now, one of the comic strips we've posted on the humor section of our board out there is a family circus thing, and I thought this would be a great one for Mother's Day. Maybe they're just doing a warm-up for it. But the little boy, and I think his name is Billy, has been moping around, and you got all of these different phases that he's going through as he's doing this or not doing that and so forth. And you see Mom peeking around the corner and so forth, taking note of what is going on here. And the last scene there that's depicted in the middle, he's in bed and he's telling his little brother Jeffy that you don't have to tell mommies when you don't feel so good. They can read your mind. Now, that's probably true. A mother is better at listening, is better at paying attention to what is going on. And us guys, maybe with some veracity to it, are not as good at listening and paying attention and picking up signals from the kids. I will freely admit my wife is much better at this than I am. She picks up on there's a problem there, not just with kids, but with individuals. Sometimes she reads it wrong, but at least she's listening. And sometimes mothers listen between the lines, as Billy's mother was listening between the lines. But in order to speak well and to speak to whatever the needs are and to say something that's encouraging, isn't it nice to begin a day and say, Lord, help me to say something or to do something that will encourage and benefit someone else today, okay? If we're going to do that wisely, then we need to be good listeners so we can see what is needed. Maybe a word is needed to hear. Maybe a presence is needed to be there, and that's all. Or maybe some assistance is needed. But we need to be good listeners before we can speak in words or in actions to the situation. Number 4, we need to be aware of our audience. In Proverbs 23, the wise man said, don't waste your breath on fools, for they will despise the wisest advice. Now, I suppose if there's a verse to remember, this would be it for today. We somehow or another think we can change a fool's mind, that we can convince him with clear evidence that this is the way it is. And we say, I'm going to answer that fool on Facebook. And I'm going to make the argument so clear that he or she will have to see what's right before their nose. Okay? If you'd read this verse, if you believe this verse, you would get out of some of that. I'm talking to myself too. All right. Someone said that, don't argue with a fool. An onlooker might not be able to tell the difference. And I like the way Mark Twain phrased it. He said, never argue with a fool. He'll drag you down to his level and he'll beat you with experience. Okay? We think somehow or another we can argue with a fool. That's our audience. Okay? And we can win the argument because we're going to make it crystal clear. But here's one of my favorite sayings. You cannot reason someone out of something that they did not reason their way into. Let that sink in. You think, if it's clear-cut reasoning and it's obvious, they're going to have to change their mind. Not a fool. Not a fool. It's not going to do it. If he has a foolish position, a foolish argument, and he didn't reason his way into it, he's not going to be reasoned out of it. Now, you've seen examples of this where you realize it or not. Talking to the mother, and she says, my boy is good. I have a good son. And you say, are you talking about the one who's in jail? Yes, I'm talking about my son in jail. Well, why is he in jail? Well, I think he was framed. Or, he may have overreacted, but I think the victim had it coming. My son is a good boy. Now, you take the opposite position of that and you say, I don't think your son is a good boy because he did some bad stuff. You are not going to win that. She didn't reason her way into that conclusion. She's not going to be reasoned out of it. It is an emotional-based conclusion, and it will need some kind of emotional solution. But you're not going to reason the person out of an emotion-based conclusion, okay? So be aware of your audience. If your audience is a fool, your ability to reason and to talk and to sway may be somewhat limited there. I like this verse too in Romans. Paul says, you may believe there's nothing wrong with what you're doing. Here you're taking advantage of your Christian freedom. And Romans 14 is about how do we treat one another when we come to different conclusions. And you say, what I'm doing here is biblical, it's right, and I'm exercising my Christian freedom. Your brother over here may think you're sinning. You may believe there's nothing wrong with what you're doing, but keep it between yourself and God. Blessed are those who don't feel guilty for doing something that they have decided is right. Okay? You're exercising your freedom. You're convinced that it is right. But he says there's a time, knowing your audience here, that they're not going to be convinced at this point anyway, with your words, that what you're doing is okay. You have the freedom, let's say, to drink wine in moderation. And someone says, I believe that any kind of alcoholic beverage is wrong under any circumstance. Well, if you are exercising your freedom, you have that freedom. But there are some things it's better to keep to yourself and not make it an issue when you're with that individual. If you have them over to your home, don't try to educate their conscience and say, here, go ahead, have a drink. No, anytime I encourage them to do something that violates their conscience, I sin and they sin. Anytime you go against your conscience, what's God put there, whether it's right or wrong, it is wrong for you to violate your conscience. Because that's a safeguard, and God wants it there. It can be re-educated. There's some things I thought at one time were wrong, I now think are okay. And I'm glad for my freedom. But he says there's a time, knowing your audience, keep your mouth shut, enjoy your freedom, but don't always try to change someone in the way they're doing things. Number 5 here, we need to be aware of the importance of timing. And this kind of goes along with the last point there, that I'm exercising my freedom. This individual here, it would bother his conscience if he were to do it. There may be a time when it's okay to say something, if you say it in the right way, in the wise way, okay? But now may not be the time. Ask God to help you with discerning the time. Jesus himself said to his disciples, I still have many things to say to you, but you cannot bear them now. Jesus says, I want to say more. There's a lot to be said beyond what I've already told you. And I want to open up more and more to you, but you're not ready for it. Timing is important. You've experienced that with your own children, haven't you? When you want them to learn lessons and you want them to learn how to relate this way or that way, and yet you know it's not time. They're not ready for that. They wouldn't understand. And so you give it to them a little at a time, and then eventually they get the point of what you were trying to teach in a gentle way. There's another passage here in Proverbs, chapter 15. Everyone enjoys a fitting reply. It is wonderful to say the right thing at the right time. Well, I said the right thing, but the timing wasn't right. And this is a challenge. Let me leave you with that challenge. To find out what time it is in someone's life. Where are they right now? Are they open? Would they listen to a word? Are they open to me? Are they open to someone else? Ask God to help you with this. Lord, help me to see what time it is in this person's life. Are they open to encouragement? Are they open to a good news word? Sometimes you can say the right thing, but the timing is off, and they're not ready to listen. My wife and I had an experience yesterday with someone that kind of opened up, and it all just went so well. And I thought, wow, how did all this happen? I'd like to go into more details about that, but I can't. And the timing was set around a casual conversation, but my impression from that meeting was, boy, we really connected. And I think a door is beginning to open. We'll see. Timing. Ask God to help you to discern the time. Walk circumspectly, wisely, knowing the time, because the days are evil. And when the window of opportunity is there, that's the time, because it may soon close. It's a beautiful thing when we are able to say the right thing, a good thing, at the right time. To use words wisely. Pray about it. I might say even that prayer works, but we're not sure how it works. And let's have the modesty and the humility when we're dealing with others. Is that going to be a statement that they would hear the way I mean it? Or would I be clear with my words and yet they're hearing something else? It's a challenge. to use words wisely. Let's take that as our challenge. If you'd like to respond with a prayer request or some other request, would you do that while we stand and sing? The Lord bless you and keep you.